Okay.
Hello and welcome to another episode edition of the Drawing Room Experts. This is Zaib. Hope you guys are doing well. This particular topic that I wanted to discuss today, it has been a long time coming, at least for me, because there's another side of my personality that I haven't really delved into too much on this podcast, and that is my affinity and um, my liking towards poetry. And although predominantly it's Urdu poetry, but I've dabbled myself with just English poetry as well, and I find that really interesting. I find wordplay of any kind really interesting. Hence, why I really enjoy using puns because it's just wordplay. So wanted to talk about that, but then there's so many facets to it. It's just it appears to me as an outside looking in person, very closely guarded skill set. Like the poets feel like they like to hang out with one another, and they're very close knitted group. And there's obviously some politics between them as well, as as it would be amongst any human being. But the idea is that they're not really inclusive per se. I mean, at least my interactions or my associations with poets has been given me that impression. So wanted to do this one, but I really needed someone who can help me talk through this. Maybe is a poet himself, or is aspiring to be one, or writes really well. So I mean, that really gave me an opportunity to look around the community. So the guest that I have for today's episode is an aspiring poet. He's just started his Instagram page, and he writes really well, albeit on the religious side. But words are words, right? It's all meant to communicate his feelings at the time. So without any further ado, I have Mr. Sarosh Jafri. Sarosh.
Hey, how you doing, Zaib?
Good, man.
Thank you
How are
for
you
having
doing?
me.
Yeah,
Doing
yeah, no.
fantastic. So I just wanted to make a couple corrections. One, I've been a poet for a while,
Okay.
inspiring in the sense that I have just started going more mainstream with
Right. Yeah,
my
that's what I
poetry
meant.
with the
Yeah.
Instagram. I've poetry's been a part of me at least since I was like 13, 14 years old, when in my English class I learned that I could write and did not have to follow any grammatical rules.
That's
Because
interesting. That's something I really wanted to talk to you about, and we'll get to that. But I wanted to get
Mhm.
your journey first, right? So
Sure.
you're a remind me, your background is computer science, right?
Economics.
Economics. Okay,
Economics.
cool. All right.
Yeah.
So much closer to what my background is, to
Mhm.
i.e. accounting. But
Mhm.
so you're an accounting economics background person who has probably spent a huge chunk of his life in the US, right? So you
Mhm.
haven't really had poetic surroundings per se as you would if you were living, let's say, in Karachi, right? Because I've lived most of
Exactly.
my life in Karachi. We used to go to mushairas all the time,
Mhm.
especially during this month of Rajab and Shaban. There's a lot of gatherings that are held that are very inspirational, because I used to attend them late into the nights, and I really admired people staying up late to just listen to some really nice poetry. And it
Mhm.
really is artistic in that sense. So
Mhm.
not really surrounded by that here per se. Your background, as such, you said, is not really close to literature and all of that stuff. How did you find yourself here in the first place?
So
And why poetry? Why not just like
mhm.
speaking, speech and all of that stuff?
It's an interesting journey. It's like I said, it started in my eighth grade class, English class. We had this assignment where our teacher was like, okay, you can do poetry. We're going to learn about poetry. And I'm like, okay, what is poetry? Up till that point, my concept of poetry, being from originally from Pakistan and from the Indian subcontinent, was Iqbal and Ghalib and Rabindranath Tagore,
Right.
and these, like, as you mentioned, these almost Ivory League or Ivory Tower giant literary giants who look down at the townspeople and commentate on them.
Right.
But then, and the thing was, being someone who was born in Pakistan, I was 8 when I moved here, and for a really long time, English was not my strongest suit. In fact, I hated English. That
Okay.
was the worst subject I had, and obviously, a lot of that had to do with the fact that I was literally learning a brand new language,
Mm-hmm.
and learning. And anyone who is not a native English speaker knows English is a very confusing language.
Yep. Yep.
So all of a sudden, like I have this, you know, break from, having to write these structured, prose, as they say, or like essays and stuff, and where I can literally write 2 words and that could be considered a poem.
Okay.
And the other part, I guess, like poetry in a way was in me, like the germ was there because my mom's uncle is the late great Zafar Jafri, who was involved in Radio Pakistan in Islamabad.
Oh, nice. I
So
didn't
he
know
was
about
one.
that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The thing is, I really didn't know about it either. My mom would used to mention it, but as a kid, I was like, okay, I don't know what Radio Pakistan is, right?
Right. Right. Right.
But so he was obviously a literary giant of his time, and my father always, like, he loved reading, and he was
Okay.
a subject matter expert, like an armchair expert on almost every subject. And I think, and my brothers say this, and everybody in my family says this, I've basically inherited that germ of his. And to me, poetry, initially, obviously, my poetry wasn't good. It was terrible, but it gave me a way of expressing my thoughts. And it was a challenge in a way where I was not restricted, but I was restricted,
Mm-hmm.
where I had to say something without actually openly saying it. And initially I was obviously, like, I'm really into hip hop, and I'm really, and if you look at hip hop, and especially like if you look at old school hip hop, it's a lot of rhythm and a lot of poetic mastery that's
Right.
going on there. Especially if you look at like the old stuff of Tupac, or other like Nas. But
Mm-hmm.
also the thing was, although I didn't go to Mushairas, I was really into poetry, like at Sabah, and at the time Azakhan Azara, like
Right.
especially on the Jushans, we would have like poets and we would have poetry sessions. And it was really interesting how the play on word would happen. And the thing that really got me into it was I would listen to these poets, and I was really fascinated by what they were doing. And I'm also a Naha reciter, so for that, like especially when I started reciting like Sache Bhai's Nahe
Right.
or like Zia Bhai's Nahe, those are poetically, they're very in depth.
Right.
So
They
it
are.
it
Yeah.
gave me an appreciation for the art. and
Absolutely. Yeah.
and the beauty of poetry, what I try to do at least, is I try to infuse Western style hip hop with like the shairi of like Pakistani poets, like even like the works of Faz and Iqbal and Ghalib, where it's very tongue in cheek.
Uh-huh.
And I really enjoyed that. And I guess that's a universal thing with like performance arts, where a lot of hip hop, obviously, it's a performance piece, and a lot of like the works of Faz and other greats like him, they turn into ghazals or manqabats, which themselves are performance pieces.
Right.
So which gives you a really interesting look and how to play with that. So I guess that's where my journey started. But I think the what I would say was the actual maturity of my poetry came in my 12th grade, in the senior year of a high school. I took a poetry class. I was able to take a poetry class instead of an English class because to me that was, I had been writing poetry for about a couple of years, like 3 4 years at that point. And I was like, okay, this is an easy A class because all I'm going to be doing is writing different forms of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And in the senior year, like the senior paper, we had to research on a poet. And I decided to go after Iqbal. And that led me down to a very interesting place where I was fascinated by what Iqbal was able to do and how it wasn't just, lovey-dovey poetry that we hear, like roses are red, violets are
Right.
blue.
Yeah.
It was revolutionary poetry, and it was thought-provoking poetry, which, it wasn't just for entertainment, but it was actually an institution of learning. And that's what inspired me. Around that same time, I was really into Walt Whitman. And
Hmm.
so, taking these different poets from different parts of the world, it really, got me, started on my journey where I am today.
Nice, nice. So, what comes to mind is obviously the fact that you've mentioned a couple of times that that when your poetry started to become a little more mature.
Mhm.
What was that like? How do you differentiate between the two of like immature poetry or poet like? Is it just going back in time and looking at what you wrote way back when and saying, oh, that maybe that wasn't that good? Because at the time, obviously, you liked it, right?
Mhm.
So is it always like an evolutionary process where whatever you're writing right now, maybe a few
Mhm.
years down the line you read back and you say, oh, maybe it wasn't that good. Now I'm better than this and I'm evolved more. What do you think?
So definitely, yeah, no, that's definitely a part of it. Obviously, the more practice makes perfect, right?
Right.
The more you practice anything, you become better at it. But the other thing for me was, I think once I had graduated high school and I got into college, that's when I really started to realize, my poetic potential. And and even then, like I would write, but a lot of my poetry I would not share. And then in 2014, I moved to Texas, and I had this was in 2015. It was around 13th of Rajab. I had posted the this piece that I've actually posted, like one of my latest pieces that I posted on my poetry page on my Facebook, and a bunch of people gave a positive reaction to it,
Was that the one
including
that you
the
wrote
local.
on a page and it has like flowers next to it,
No,
something like that?
no, not that one. There's the new one. It's actually the one. If you go on my Instagram page, it's the one with the Raza of Imam Ali,
Oh,
and it's
okay,
written
yeah,
in
yeah.
English. Yeah.
Ah, gotcha. Yes, yes, yes.
So and it was my ode to Imam Ali, and that actually caught a lot of people's eyes, and that made me realize that poetry was a gift for me. That I it wasn't just about poetry. And up till that point, I would like using an Urdu term, "ghair meari." Like
Hmm.
a lot of times, you hear the shayad say, "I'm not gonna. I'll just recite this now, but this is not gonna be a part of my poem because it's ghair meari." I never understood that, but once I had written that piece, I understood what it meant. Like ghair meari, meaning like this is not to the standard. And
Hmm.
then you, it's uh, it's about how much thought you put into a poem. That each line, like for instance, when I'm writing a poem, I basically have a general outline of where I want a poem to go, but it's about like you write a, a line or two, and then you do have to take a break because you have to mentally think about, okay, I want this concept to be put in, excuse me, or infused, but how do I encapsulate that without making it forced?
Hmm.
And I think that's when I, that once I mastered that, and the fact that I was willing to go back and edit and revise my poetry, that's, I think, when I became a true poet. Because, like with any good uh, piece of art or any good piece of, anything that you create, you have different marks, right? You have mark one, mark two, mark three, draft one, draft two, draft three, and it's about going through the drafts and going through the motions. And like obviously, the first draft is always, let me put the thoughts down on the paper, and then it's about going back and seeing what's working and what's not.
So, I mean, how many drafts do you have in mind when you're writing something? When do you feel like, okay, I'm in a good spot. This is working well, or this is at a mature place in terms of what I want to say.
It depends, honestly, depends on the piece. I mean, I've had pieces where, the one draft was more than plenty. Then there are pieces that, I'm still editing, and I've been editing for years because, it's perfect at that time. But then I come back and, I'm at a different state or a different mindset, and I'm like, no, this is not going to actually work.
Right.
Let me, or, you're reading something, and at the time when you're writing and you're like, oh, this is a great concept. And then later you're like, no, this seems a little too forced, or maybe I didn't say enough, and trying to better encapsulate that.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing to me, it's until you have published your piece, it's going to be edited. It's going to continue to be edited. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. When poets are performing their piece, that may not be the actual poem that they have written.
They're actually like
Because
changing it on the spot.
yes, I've done that. Like, for instance, if I'm saying something and I'm rhythmically saying something and something else is flowing with it, I'd rather say that than to hesitate and mess up.
Right, 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 right.
And that actually a key point on that is, if you look at Nohas, there's certain Nohas, they will sound virtually the same, but they'll have, one or two words switched around,
Right.
or they'll have, and that's because depending on the reciter, they may have to improvise.
Oh yeah, I've done that plenty of times, especially when I feel like that the word is a little difficult to really flow while, especially
Exactly.
Nohas there, you only have a microsecond to say those words out.
Exactly.
You can't really
Exactly.
muck about. I mean, when you're reciting, let's say a salam or anything like that, you can, slow it down. The pace is yours. You can do whatever you want. But with the Noha, there's a certain rhythm that you have to
Yeah.
maintain.
There's a beat
So,
going on the background, and it's by a bunch of people who will let you know shortly when you're offbeat.
oh yeah, absolutely. And you'll know itself. And then my problem is that whenever that offbeat thing happens, I am in a very dangerous spot to really lose my head and start laughing. And
Exactly.
that is not the place you
Exactly.
want to be, right? Especially in that time.
No,
Um,
I've had
right, you're right.
my fair share,
Exactly. And
especially
that's
when
yeah, go ahead.
exactly when especially I actually have a funny story. 10th of Muharram, this was in Austin. There's an uncle there who he's very passionate,
Right.
and he starts doing nare and stuff. And I was reciting Amir Lashkar Hussain, and as you know, Amir Lashkar Hussain
Yeah,
is one of those nahas where the matam is in the chorus, not
exactly.
in the
Not in the
and
yeah,
yeah.
the
And
verses,
I
yeah.
said, yeah, and I had said, the verse, "Ye Zulfiqar Haidari, ye Sher bin Shah Najaf, ye
Yes.
Teghz Hashimi Nishan be." So when I was saying that, uh, this uncle got very passionate, and he let out an Ali Mala and then Ya Ali Madad, and and it's dead silent, and I literally had to walk away from the mic for a good like 2 seconds and
Really?
compose my sense, because I was gonna burst out laughing, and it was the 10th of Muharram.
Oh my
And
God.
and they had tasked me with reciting the Naha, because at that center we have like only three Nahas, which is in English, Farsi, Urdu, right? And
Oh
I was
yeah, yeah.
reciting the
So,
Urdu Naha, and
uh,
Urdu Naha is the one which was going to have all the matam.
exactly. And it's
So,
a
and if
beautiful
I
note, by
screw,
the way, that one. That
it
it
is, it
has the
is,
most beautiful words. It almost
it does.
borderlines a salam, if any. I mean, you can it
It's
kind of works both ways. You can recite it on the 4th of Shaban as well as
yes,
on the 8th of
indeed,
Muharram. It can
indeed,
kind of work,
indeed, and
yeah.
it's one of the greatest odes to Hadrat Abbas.
Oh yeah,
It's
absolutely. Hands down.
and it's a powerful Naha. In fact, one of my wishes is one day to go to Makkah al-Mukarramah and recite that Naha from top of the Kaaba.
Oh, mashallah. Yeah, absolutely. An ode to the man himself who recited that
Yes,
amazing
yes,
sermon on the top of the Kaaba, of course.
yes,
Um,
yes.
so yeah, it's interesting, right? With the
Mhm,
poetry. One
mhm,
thing that I was wondering about poetic maturity and the rules that are associated with it. I wanted to
mhm,
get your thoughts on the grammar. I mean, something that you discussed earlier in the
mhm,
podcast, and I was wondering that. Okay, I
mhm,
wanted to have a deeper dive on that.
mhm,
Um, so help me understand the use of grammar. I understand why grammar is in place because my biggest pet. pet peeve growing up when I was learning the language, be it
Mm,
Urdu or English. You'd have
mm,
your Urdu grammar lessons and English grammar
mm,
lessons,
mhm,
and I was losing my head because I would be in positions where I thought I could speak the language,
mhm,
but I would have people who cannot speak the language correct my grammar.
mhm.
And I was like, dude, you can't even talk. I mean, what are you trying to do here?
Exactly.
So my pet peeve has always been like the use of grammar and our or almost like being at a point of being a grammar Nazi, right? You know what a grammar Nazi
Mhm.
is, right?
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
so is grammar meant to control the expression of the language, where the language itself is there to communicate your thoughts to the other person? That's the whole use of the
Mhm,
language. You
mhm.
feel like grammar is somewhat of a party pooper in that situation.
To me, grammar is, and especially Urdu grammar,
Yeah.
right? It's and it like we can even have a whole discussion on Urdu and how it's the language of the court, right?
Right, right, right.
And and then you have the British English, and the thing is, unfortunately, grammar is a gatekeeper.
Okay.
That's what it is. It's a gatekeeper. It's there to distinguish the have-nots from
The
the
haves.
elites of society, the haves, the elites of the society. And honestly, that is one of my critique of poetry and my critique of uh, literary writing is that if you look at it, these are all ivory tower scholars. These are academics, even ulama, right? And Zakirin, if you look at them, like
It's a big boys club.
uh, yes, it's not. I wouldn't even say it's a big boys club. It's a elite country club, like Karachi
Yeah.
club. Okay,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
Karachi club, and you go there and you feel that either you are in the center of all authority when it comes to language, or you feel like you're completely out of place.
There's nowhere in
And
between. Yeah.
exactly, and the thing that I do with my poetry, and I've had a lot of criticism from some of my friends that I do use big words. That's my thing, and but my reasoning for that is I want my readers to go and look up those words, because it's a way of educating people.
So you're
And
telling me it's
it's
not to show off those big
no,
words.
it's not to show up. No, no, no. It's if you don't know a word, you should look it up. I am I'm a big proponent in reading and learning, and
Picking
in
up
the
the
concept of
dictionary.
exactly, and what Maula Ali alayhi salam says, keep learning from the cradle to the grave.
Right.
And to me, when you're the what I try to do with my poetry is I try to democratize it. Okay, I even though like my poetry, you've read some of my works, and
Yeah.
a lot of people that you mentioned that poets tend to stick together. Most of my friends are not poets. Majority of my friends would not understand Mir from Ghalib. Okay,
Right.
that's to them they don't even know what the word takhallus would be.
Yeah.
Although I do have some friends that are like I want to give a shout out to my good friend Muhammad Hassan Naqvi from the Bay Area, from Daribatul,
Right.
who actually he is one of my biggest critics when it comes to using big words, but he also comes from a family of literary poet masters. Like his both of his uncles are his mamus are poets. His cousin, brother Amr Shavar, is also a poet, and his grandfather, his nana, was also a poet. So he comes and so I can take his criticism, but to me, I don't want poetry to be locked up in an ivory tower where it's not accessible to people.
And that's what
And
I feel like grammar kind of acts as
mhm,
that, right? It's like
it
so
does.
you're absolutely right. It's a doorkeeper, right? So you
Mhm,
enter it and you have to say the secret code and the password is do what I
exactly,
say, right? So
exactly.
you feel like that really loses the purpose, because my understanding, it's kind of like a catch 22, right?
Mhm,
Because language is meant to communicate feelings, your
Mhm.
thoughts, in whatever manner you want, right? Day one, we didn't
Mhm.
have grammar. There has to be a day
Mhm.
where there was no
Mhm.
grammar in any language, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Built grammar at the time, I'm assuming, just to organize the language itself. But
Mhm.
as time went on, I mean, we don't speak the same Urdu or English that was spoken in the 18th century, right? 100 couple of
Exactly.
we don't so we're not probably using the same words, we're not using the
Mhm.
same way of delivering a stanza, right? But
Exactly.
the big point is that at the time you were able to communicate your thoughts well.
Mhm.
Shakespeare did it, people understood him at the time.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned, of poets of our time or people of our time who write, they're
Mhm.
doing it using whatever language is accessible and understandable right now. So
Exactly.
why do we have to like adhere by the rules of the 18th century? I mean, who's to say that was perfect versus what is now? So you know what I mean? I mean,
Mhm.
I just want to
Exactly.
understand why is there so much of a, like, people get worked up when
Mhm.
especially poets, they get worked up if you don't use the right word, or
Mhm.
dude, I'm just trying to communicate something. Do you not
Exactly.
understand what I'm saying?
Exactly. The problem is more to do with ego.
Thank you.
The issue is ego,
Thank you.
and uh, the concept of I am a gatekeeper. Like grammar is a gatekeeper, and then poets are the gatekeepers of grammar itself.
Right.
And the thing is, it's like for instance, if you are an expert, like for instance, you're an expert in accounting, right? And you see some kid coming up and who wants to, who's trying to get into accounting, although you may help him with the accounting, but you're still going to have this whole, like there's some secrets that you have learned, some
Yeah.
accounting tricks that you're not going to want to pass on just yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you want to size that kid up if that they're worthy. Likewise, I think a lot of poets, they get lost in that, where it is a, poetry, as they say, is a language of the soul. And the beauty about poetry is any language you go into in the world, uh, from dead languages to the modern languages that have just been around like maybe a couple centuries, each and every one of them have a poetic artistic aspect to them.
Yep.
And when you hear poetry, you don't even have to be in, like, you don't even have to understand the language, but it's poetry. I'll give you an example. And I know this is going to go counter to what we as Muslims believe, but if you listen to the Quran,
Right.
yes, Allah said it's not poetry, but if you were to do a secular dissection of the Quran, it's a very poetically written doctrine. And you can tell that apart from, if you ever go to any of the Arabic speaking majlises, because you can tell when they're reciting the Quran versus when they're just speaking.
Right. Right.
And, and for the Arabs, by the way, fun little tidbits for your listeners, poetry was an art form, and it was anyone, like you had to be a great poet. Like uh, they used to
It
call
was a
people who could
privilege.
not.
Yeah.
It was a privilege, and if you were not able to do poetry, you were called mute.
He couldn't
This
speak.
person
Yeah.
can You
Yeah.
cannot speak if you cannot do poetry, because, and this is why that's the beauty of the Quran, right? Like
Yeah.
it came, and to be honest, like the great thing about poetry, because there is no structure, it's almost an elite task
Mm-hmm.
to be able to take language and articulate what you want to articulate without, following the grammatical rules. It's almost like, like when you look at like a race car driver, right? They know the basics of driving, but they're not following the rules. Like
Exactly.
it's doing it so with such finesse that it's seamless, and and that's the thing with poetry. And it is an art form, and it takes years of mastery. But the thing is, anyone can do it if they're willing to put in the time. Like as I
But
mentioned, my back. Yeah,
yeah, as
go
long as
ahead.
time is the only barrier to entry, I'm happy with it. My only
Mhm.
concern, as I mentioned, is not it's not the time part. It's just, as you said, democratization of the poetic art
Mhm.
itself needs to happen,
Mhm.
because Why do we only have, let's say in our community, we only have a handful of
Mhm.
people who can recite poetry or write poetry,
Mhm.
right? Handful.
Mhm.
That shouldn't be the case, right?
It shouldn't.
Especially when there are far more people who are reciting nohas and salams like myself. I
Mhm.
recite, I don't recite my work because I don't write my work,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But if I'm
Mhm.
already halfway there, that I'm reciting something and I appreciate the poetry, that's why I'm reciting it, right? Because I'm not
Mhm.
reciting anything I read. I recite, oh
Mhm.
yeah, this sounds really good. There's some good words in there, and I'll be
Mhm.
able to better communicate this. So I definitely have the taste of it.
Mhm.
Um, so what's stopping me, I would think, is, or people like me from making that extra step and start writing their own stuff, is the fact that the barrier to entry is not the time you put in. The barrier to entry, hey, the rules, these are the rules. Dem's the rules. So you got to follow these rules,
Exactly.
otherwise you're mute, as you said, right?
Exactly.
So, uh, is there? Do you feel like you're challenging that with a, not just writing, but then b, you're using a different language to what conventional poets in our community use, which is English, right?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
do you feel like you're challenging that norm, pushing the envelope a little bit, and say, hey, you know what? Just back off. You do your thing, and let me do mine.
Mhm. Definitely. And that's the thing with me and a lot of my friends who do poetry, because all my friends that I really associate with as far as poets, they're all English poets.
That's
Uh,
good. Yeah.
and the reason for that is, like I said, poetry is the language of the soul, and it's a reflection of society where it is at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So you cannot take the work of, for instance, Mir Anis or like Mir Taqimir or Dabir and say that is what we are poetically today.
No, we're far from it.
We are far from it. I mean, today's poetry, like and using I would say क्या कहते हैं, uh, Urdu religious poetry, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned Mir Anis, and Mir Anis is probably the greatest Urdu poet of all time, in my opinion.
The Burians probably
But
might disagree, but yeah, go ahead.
mhm,
There,
exactly,
there's a divide,
exactly,
right? There's a
of
like a
course.
passionate group of people who go for, like, who are
Mhm.
Anisians and the Burians. Like it's a
Yes,
thing.
yes, exactly. But like Mir Anis and Dabir, they are
Absolutely, yeah.
basically the
Giants.
pillars of Urdu poetry. Yes.
Oh yeah.
However, as someone growing up in the 21st century, the works of Dr. Rehan Azmi were more reflective of what I understood.
Digestible, I would say.
Yes, digestible. Because, for instance, if you look at even the works of Maulana Hassan Imdad, which and the late Zamir Akhtar Sahab,
Yeah.
their poetry was what Sache Bhai was reciting,
It's, well, wasn't
and
he writing as well, Sajjabhai?
he wrote as well, and he was one of the rare poet reciters
Mm-hmm.
because he mastered that art,
And he,
and
like,
he
I've read some of his work, and I was so
mhm,
surprised when it said, written by Sajjabhai, and I was like, wow, this is like a
ex-
legitimate poet writing, and the guy,
exactly,
to
and
think that the guy was just a reciter and also wrote really, really well.
exactly, and honestly, unfortunately, this is a lost art. There was a time when poetry was taught. There was a time when reciters knew how to recite and be able to write. And I honestly personally believe that if you are reciting, you should be writing something. It doesn't have to be in Urdu, it can be in English, but you have to write something, because you're not gonna you may appreciate it as a reciter, as a listener of the poem, but you will not be able to fully understand, जैसे जो उर्दू में कहते हैं कलम बंद करना.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you an example. I have written a piece that I shared with one of my friends. Like, people who are not poets, they were like, "Yeah, this is good." But then people who are poets, and when what they understood it. For instance, I wrote a piece a while back called "The Light of Creation" about a few months ago during Ayam Fatima. And most people, they heard it, they were like, "Oh, this is really good," including my wife. She's not really into poetry. She really liked the poem, but she didn't appreciate it that way. But then when I showed it to my cousin Sean Jafri, who is also a poet, he himself was like able to point out that, oh, you are talking about ayat tatir being nazil,
Right.
because and you don't get that until the very end. But if you're listening to the poem, I'm talking about Bibi Fatima and her relationship in the divine court, and how in the end, how Allah is, I think the line, and let me just quickly cite that, the last piece of that line,
Yeah, go
if
ahead.
I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
uh,
I think we lost her video.
yeah, 1 second. I'm using my phone, so
Oh, okay. Yeah,
that's
no
why.
problem. No
Yes,
problem.
so I apologize. So, like, where I go, indeed, for while your oppressors and murderers shall perish, indeed, in eternal damnation, for you are Fatima, the divine light, it in its complete formation. You are not in need of exhibiting your lineage or relations, yet even the Lord Almighty introduces his prophet through your association.
Yep.
And
That's
it's,
that's Hadith Kisa, right?
yes, Hadith Kisa right there. And, you know, to be able, it's a very subtle piece. It's a very subtle nod to Hadith Kisa. And it's like, because that's the other thing I try to do in my poetry is I take these very complex concepts and I try to bring them in and subtly pass by. Like I just want to do a touch and go,
Yeah.
where those who get it, and those who don't, at least they still get a good,
Exactly.
poetic
For I
shit.
could understand for someone who wouldn't get it, will probably think it as a
Mhm.
poetic uh
Exactly.
poetic verse to say how great she
Mhm.
is, right? That, oh,
Exactly.
people were introduced because of you, but while
Exactly.
actually that is, that is the fact of the matter, right? So that's beautiful. That's
Exactly.
beautiful.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
one thing I wanted to ask you before I move
Mhm.
into a very important thing that I wanted your thoughts on. Why English and not Urdu?
To be honest with you, because Urdu has way too many guards.
Oh,
Urdu
okay.
poetry is way too structured.
So
And
that's what I was referring to, right?
Mhm.
Because it's just
Exactly.
someone like you who's interested, obviously, someone who like you who
Mhm.
wants to do it was
Mhm.
discouraged because of the ego, as you mentioned, of the
The
people
ego,
surrounding,
and I mean, I
judgments
remember
of these
when,
people
yeah, and I have been personally a victim of that in a way where I had written something. I'm not
in
going to
Urdu.
mention the name. Yeah, and I had brought it to the attention of someone who was an Urdu poet. I'm not going to mention their names. I recited for them, and they just smiled at me, not a encouraging smile, but like almost like a mocking smile,
Oh
and
boy!
just walked away like I was not worth their time. And then
Without
I,
saying anything, they walked away.
yeah, and
What
yeah, and someone else
was this
who
person? Was this
my
person in the community? In our community? Is he here?
yes, and that's why I don't want to say their name.
Okay.
And then someone else who was also there with me who saw that, they actually came and they broke it down for me what I had done wrong. And they were like, look, you're not following like the Urdu poetry structure. And there's like words like matta and makta, and there's like different like each misra has like the sani and all that, and like
Yeah.
I didn't care about all that because that's not what you do in English poetry. And to me, that was the issue with that. Was this person, by the way, they're a good poet, but I wouldn't say they're Miranese. Okay, they're not. You know, I mean, they may consider themselves to
If
be,
I if I know who
our,
this if I know if I guess
you
correctly who this
you
person,
know,
if I guess who the
the
person is, then I know that they probably think they're Mutanese.
yes, yes, you know who it is.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's put it this way.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. I don't know why I
and
knew as the moment you mentioned it, I thought I knew who it was.
yeah, it is that person. I'm not
Okay.
gonna, and to be honest with you, if you look at them, they're actually a case study on this. The way they carry themselves. That is the profile of an Urdu poet.
Yep. Yep.
Of I am somebody. I can recite. I can write. Tum kuch nahi ho.
And you know what the funny
And
thing is? Funny thing is
mhm,
about that attitude is that
mhm,
you at one point you believe that you this prowess, you have this
Mhm.
amazing art to recite
Mhm.
Urdu poetry, and you're so good at
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
And that might be the case, but at the same time, uh, you consider people who can recite or not reciting as someone like B grade people. But at the end of
Exactly.
the day, you are reciting it for them
Mhm.
to actually appreciate you, because you're not keeping this in your
Exactly.
heart. You're coming in to the centers or whatever, right? You're reciting that poetry for these peasants
Mhm. Mhm.
to
The lay
get the
person, the laity, yes.
exactly to get their appreciation, while you don't consider them even worthy to be at the same level as you are, which is kind of ironic, right? You're trying to get appreciation, validation from people who you don't even like, I
Exactly.
guess, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And that's, at least in my religious poetry, that was something that so one thing about poets do have egos. I have an ego. Okay. And some of my pieces, I've written
Yeah, that's why it was
pieces.
so hard to get you on this, man.
Definitely. Yeah, no, but the thing is, poets do have egos. And like, I'll give you a great example of Aziz Miyakaval and the Sabri brother, right? They, if you know much about Qawwali, a lot of their poems, or a lot of their Qawwalis, like for instance, Mai Sharabi
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've heard that
by
one.
Sabri brothers,
Yeah.
and Hai Kam Baktu Ne Pi Nahi
Uh-huh.
by Aziz Mia. They are talking about things, but at the same time, if you know the internal feud that's going on, they're dissing each other, and they're literally,
It's a
it's a
Qawwali
diss
battle.
against.
It's a Qawwali
It is,
battle.
it is, and just exactly. And the thing is, in hip hop, that's like a rap battle,
Yeah.
and like one of the biggest rap feuds of all time was Biggie and Tupac, and they both died because of it. But or like Nas and Jay-Z, and but so poets do have the ego, right? But it's not about not having an ego. It's more about when you see, to me, if I see some kid or someone younger than me or even someone older than me that is interested in the poetic arts, right? To give them a word of encouragement, even if their first piece is trash, be all like, yes, it's not as good as it could be, but let's
And trust
work
me,
on it
I'm
together.
pretty sure they know when they're writing
Of
their first
course,
piece.
of
They
course.
know it's not the best piece. So you drilling it down in their head and saying that, hey, bro, you got to improve it. That's not what they're listening. What That's not what they're trying to hear from you.
Mhm,
What they're trying to hear
exactly.
from you is
And
that, hey, am I on the right path? That's what they want to
mhm,
hear from you, and that's all you can do to say that, hey, keep
exactly,
continuing, keep working. You're good at it. You're gonna get better. That's all they want to hear.
exactly.
You don't have to say that, oh, you're Anis now, and that's it. Your first
Yeah,
poem is Anis level. Of
yeah,
course not.
yeah. And even Anis wasn't Anis on his first poem.
Yeah,
Mir Taqi Mir wasn't Mir Taqi Mir when he first wrote his works. So I
wasn't
mean,
Ghalib's first work about like a Bakri ka bacha?
I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. Knowing Ghalib, he was very
I
entertaining.
do read it. I think I'm. Don't quote me on this, but I think I remember reading that particular. His first poetic work was about
Mhm,
when he wrote as a kid was about
mhm,
Bakri ka bacha. So you
mhm.
see, that's the level.
And exactly. And to be honest with you, the poet's language is Urdu. Okay, that is without a doubt. I am willing to fight anyone for it, and I can back it up by the fact that the greatest poet, one of the greatest poets of the 19th, late 19th, early 20th century, himself admits to this. Allama Iqbal. He has Urdu poetry, but he wrote mostly in Farsi, and the reason for that was he found it more accessible to express himself, because
F- okay, yeah, go ahead.
Urdu really does take a toll on how to perform
Urdu
and how to articulate.
Urdu is difficult for sure because there's, like you said, there's the canvas is so broad and wide
Mhm,
that
mhm.
for you to really like, there's so much to play with. Farsi,
Exactly.
I always thought Farsi was sometimes considered superior to Urdu because of the fact that it was more accessible. But
Mhm,
in terms of like poetry, I 100% agree with you that you can probably be a successful Farsi poet and not really
mhm,
attract so much criticism or like
mhm,
not criticism but like inspection for of your work.
mhm,
But if you were an Urdu poet, you're basically asking yourself to be murdered by these
Exactly.
um
You are
gatekeepers.
officially in the exactly. You are officially, if you have the ijazat to do Urdu poetry, then you are some
Oh
Parvati
yeah, yeah, yeah,
cheese.
yeah. It is. Yeah, as much as we hate that, it is something that
Mhm,
both of us, I would think, that
mhm,
would want to be in a place where. But again,
mhm.
my only beef with that
Exactly.
is that, hey, dude, I mean, come on, let's just be
No,
human about it. Let's
exactly.
just
I
not.
agree.
Yeah, yeah. Go
And I
ahead.
think one of the issue with this attitude of Urdu poetry and being gatekeepers is it is being detrimental to Urdu poetry. It's
Oh
doing an
yes,
injustice to Urdu poetry because Urdu
exactly.
poetry is amazing, but you're not getting the next generation of Urdu poets because anyone who has even a slight inkling, unless they're able to produce a a nazam at the level of Fez
Hmm.
or at the level of
But
like
again, what is that
Maulana.
level? Why do we even put that on a pedestal? Yes, they were great poets,
Exactly,
but we
exactly.
can't really have that standard because they did what they did. Now you do what you do. I mean, the only
Exactly.
thing I would take inspiration from these great, giants
Mhm,
is how beautifully they express themselves without going into
mhm,
the legalities of how they use words here and there. No, it's just
mhm.
beauty. I mean, I read Fez and I'm just mesmerized by so beautifully he puts the words together, right? I
Exactly,
think
exactly.
Mir Taqi Mir was the one who said that, whenever I start to write, the words just come to me as if they were my slaves, and they were like,
Mhm.
use me the way you want to use me. I think, I don't know, it was Mir Taqi or whoever it
Exactly,
was, but
exactly.
poets usually have that. So it's about
Mhm.
putting the words beautifully in a manner that really attracts people like myself, who's not a poet, or people
Definitely,
who are not even into literature. They'd be amazed and feel
exactly,
like, oh wow, that's so beautiful.
exactly. And I 100% agree. And that I think is the problem is where this is where I believe we need to democratize poetry.
Yeah.
And many of you know the poets, even from Pakistan and India, that are coming, if you look at it, they're not producing works in Urdu or in Hindi. They're producing it in English. I'll give you a great example of that. Rupi Kaur.
Hmm.
Rupi
Never heard of that
Kaur
name.
is a Canadian Indian poetess, and her works is in English. And the reason for that, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, is that we have made this such an elite, as you said, big boys club that we don't let anyone who is interested be able to grow. And for that's why, like, the thing is, what I have in my poetry, what I've at least tried to do is, yes, I can't do Urdu poetry, but I can be inspired by Urdu poets and take that raw passion that they have
Hmm.
and infuse that into English poetry. And that's why my poetry is very different from a lot of other English poets that you'll come across.
Absolutely. Are there like English poetry mushairas or anything like that?
So they do have poetry slams, they do have open mics, and they're more impromptu, but we're working on getting more, um, you
How
know,
does What's the English version of saying like "va va" in English poetry? Is like "wow" and "well done, mate" and
well,
"oh
people will
snap."
start clapping. Oh, snap. Yeah, snapping their fingers
Oh,
and
really?
like,
They actually do
yeah,
that?
snap. Yeah, yeah.
I didn't know that. I was just joking.
If you, yeah. If you are feeling a poem, you're gonna start snapping, or once the guy is finished, you're gonna get a standing ovation.
Wow.
And
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. What about like in Urdu poetry? I know there's like "va va" and "subhanallah." Like,
so
how do you motivate the poet when they're reciting in the middle of it? Like how they're when they're in the middle of it?
well, it depends on the poet. So, for instance, I have some poetry where I do tabarra, and I remember 2018 in Texas we had Camp Faraj,
Yeah.
which is an annual camp, kind of like how we have Camp Noor here in Bay Area,
Right.
but over there, all the from Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, everybody comes together, with the ulama. And I was sitting there and I recited my piece, and it's funny because the Maulanas that were sitting in front of me, they are very I wouldn't say anti-Tabara, but they push the Wahdat al-Muslimin narrative. And so it was,
By the way,
it was,
anyone who's listening, tabara means disassociation before you
yes,
start to lose your shit.
yes,
Yeah,
yes, exactly. So I went and I said, like, like the last line of the poem, and it's about being a Rafida, as that's one of the things we're called as the Rafidis or the Rawafid,
one of the titles
which
we
means,
proudly wear.
yeah,
Yes.
yes, which is given to us. We're called rejectors, which
Yeah.
because we reject certain individuals and personalities in Islamic history
Right.
due to their disassociation with the Ahl al-Bayt.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my last line of that poem is, I put my hand in, I put my hand on his hand on the day of Ghadir. Thus, I reject anyone who rejects my Amir. And like there were like probably like 200-300 people, like at least 150 to 200 people in that room. And way in the back, there were some guys. They started doing Nare Hadris
Oh, nice.
because
Nice.
yeah, and and to be honest, as even in like as a reciter, the if you're sitting there and there's any South Asians there, the biggest azaz you can get, the
Yeah.
biggest
The
reward
not a
is if not a Hadri. And
Yeah.
to me, and going back to looking at the audience of my poem, especially when I do like my religious poetry, my audience for a long time, at least last I would say 5-6 years, has been not even the people sitting in front of me, and it's the Ahlul Bayt. And to me, it's
That's beautiful.
yeah, and I'm a strong believer of the Quranic ayat, what the izza man tasha, what the
What was
zilla man
Tasha?
tasha,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that
Khair. Yeah.
exactly, that they are like it's Allah who gives you izzat, and He's the one who gives you zillat. And I'm not doing my poetry for anyone else. I'm doing it for Imam Ali, for Rasulullah, and for these 14 amazing and wonderful personalities,
Guiding
and for those
lights.
who are
Yeah.
exactly. And if they're satisfied, then I'm satisfied. And if they're not satisfied, then it doesn't matter. You can give me $1 million
And the
as
crowd
a prize.
chanting your name from the rooftops. That's
Exactly.
not going to be enough. Yeah.
Exactly.
Um.
And
Yeah.
that
Go ahead.
actually, if I may bring up a slight point on that, is
Yeah.
that is the beauty of of Urdu poetry. The zenith of Urdu poetry obviously would be like Marsiya
Right.
and Naha Khani and Manqabat Khani. And every poet, they want ego, right? They want to be recognized. And the beauty of this is, you're being recognized when someone else is chanting Maula Ali's name.
Yeah.
And that, to me, that's such a beautiful concept, that I know that I have made it when someone else's name is being chanted in my presence. Like
Absolutely.
nobody's going, like for instance, my pen name is Ibn Ammar. No one's doing Nare Ibn Ammar or
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Nare Sarosh. They're
Yeah.
doing Nare Haidari.
Right, right, right. Absolutely. That is quite beautiful. That is quite beautiful. Again, really, really appreciate your time on this one. This was a fantastic discussion, and I couldn't have asked for a better way to have this discussion, especially the last couplets that you recited. I would request you to re-recite them because I really love that what you just said. And on that note, we're going to end this episode. But before we do that, I want to give a huge shout out to your Instagram page, which we'll be putting in the description of this episode. Guys, do check this guy out. It's fantastic, phenomenal in English. Not many poets out there right now who are trying to keep this art form alive, especially with the a youthful exuberance that that this art was initially meant for, right? So really happy that you're doing the work. Keep it up. Don't worry about the gatekeepers. Don't worry about the uncles in the communities. Do what you feel like is right. Do as you say. Give your service to the people that you give your words to, and not worry about people who are gonna forget you when you're not here. So really appreciate your time, and with that, I'll pass the mic to you to close the episode with those couple words that you just decided that were really beautiful.
Definitely. And thank you, Zaib, for having me. And I hope to continue.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
this conversation. never-ending conversation. But
Absolutely. Yeah.
I appreciate your time and your viewers' times. I hope they have learned something. And one thing that I wish to pass on, that if you're interested in poetry, just go for it. The
Hmm.
worst that's going to happen is that's going to be a crappy piece the first time, but that's how you're going to grow.
It only gets better
And
from
with
there.
that,
Yeah.
it does. And especially if you're going to religious poetry, remember, you're not writing it for the people, you're writing it for the Ahlul.
Yeah.
And with that, as per your request, I gave my hand in his hand on the day of Ghadir. Thus I rejected anyone who rejected my Amir.
Subhanallah.
Salawat ala
Subhanallah.
Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Thank you so much again for your time. We'll be in touch. I would love to have you to have more of these discussions. I'm a huge literary fan and almost like a geek as well at times. So I'm really happy that someone in the community who shares that passion, albeit in a much more advanced level, as far as you are concerned. So again, appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.